For this project, you're going to be making a letter initial with a textured background. So you can see here the letter L with the texture in the clear blue glass in the background. You can kind of see its little waves created. That texture is created using a special paper called Kiln paper. The materials you'll need for this project include a clear base, an outline of your letter, and in this case I'm choosing the letter C for my name, a Sharpie marker, scraps of colored glass, so I have a tray here, a scoring tool, a breaking tool, which is also called running pliers, glue, a glue stick, Kiln paper, one piece that's the size of your clear base, and then some scraps that are a bit smaller, and a pair of scissors. To start, place the outline of your letter underneath your clear base. Next, you will need to take a Sharpie marker and trace the outline onto your base. Although you can leave the printed outline under your base while you work, you also want to trace the outline onto your glass base in case the paper shifts and moves at all while you work. Now you need to decide what colors you want to use to create your letter. From the bin of colored glass, I have chosen to use blue and green pieces of glass. However, you can choose to make your letter any color. Using the pieces of colored glass you have chosen, you will now fill in your letter. Think of your letter like a puzzle in which you need to find pieces to fit into the outline. It is okay for there to be small gaps between pieces, but try to fill it in as best you can. If you need to trim a piece of glass to fit, you may use the scoring tool and breaking tool to do this. So for instance here, this piece is rather large, so I'm going to take my Sharpie marker and mark where I want to trim it so that it fits inside my outline. The scoring tool that we're going to be using has a tiny wheel inside, so it won't cut you, but it will make a small scratch on the glass that we're trying to cut so that it will weaken the glass enough that we can break it with our breaking tool here. When scoring or cutting the glass, you're going to place your fingers inside the grip here. We're not going to cut on top of the glass base, so I'm going to cut it next to the base here, but I'll cut it on top so you can see it. So I'm going to grip the scoring tool. I'm going to be pushing down against the glass on the line I just drew with my Sharpie and pulling away at the same time. So pushing and pulling. Now, some people prefer to push away from themselves. That's also fine to do when you're cutting. Next, we're going to take our breaking tool, also called running pliers. There's a white line on this that needs to face up towards you because what we're going to do is open up the handle here. Line that white mark up on top of the line so it makes one continuous line, so you can see it's lined up directly on top of that black mark and the score line. Squeeze and I break, and you can see now it fits right where I want it. As you are creating your project, all pieces of glass will need to be glued to your clear base. To do this, you're going to open your glue container, place your glue stick inside, and then place 2 small dots of glue on the corner edges of your piece, just like that. You don't want glue in the middle here, because what can end up happening once the piece goes into the oven, the glue becomes trapped underneath that piece in the middle, creating what could be black spots on your piece, sometimes even bubbles that break your piece. Therefore, we have you put the dots on the corners so that it can burn out from underneath. And then we place that down on your base. You will need to glue each of your pieces down so that the pieces do not shift while we are carrying it to the oven. So you can see here we have glued down all of our pieces and pretty much filled the entire outline of our letter. There are small gaps between the pieces, however, it still takes the general shape, and then our eye can read it as the letter C, which you can see here. We are going to place this aside now to make sure it's completely dry, and also because we're going to be working on our background. We're going to be creating that texture that we talked about. Here you can see in the blue glass those little waves. That's what we're going to work on creating right now. So now we're going to be working on our textured background. To start, we're going to place our large piece of kiln paper that is the size of our project down. We're going to be gluing strips of cut kiln paper on top to create that texture. So to start, you're going to take one of your scraps and you're going to want to fold that scrap into 4s. So it's kind of going to be like an accordion. And the reason we need it in 4s is because each scrap that we use has to be thick, or 4 pieces of paper thick. So instead of cutting each shape 4 times, you already have the 4 pieces here, and you only have to cut that shape once. So I'm going to make some kind of squiggly lines. Just using my Sharpie to kind of get my shape, okay? And now I'm going to cut this shape out. All like 4 pieces of paper here, I'm going to cut them out at the same time. So I'm going to grab my scissors. I'm just going to cut off the end there so it's a little easier to see. So you can see I'm cutting all 4 of those pieces at the same time, so I don't have to cut 4 times the shape, or the shape 4 times. So you see I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of the same shape, okay? So now what I'm gonna do is use my glue, and I'm gonna glue the pieces together. So I'm just putting a couple dots and gluing the pieces together. Just enough to kind of hold them together. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then there's my final piece that's going to go on top. Okay, so now I have all 4 pieces glued together, so you can see it's fairly thick. And I'm going to put some glue on the back of all 4 of the pieces that are glued together, just a couple dots. And I'm gluing that down to my paper. Now, I'm going to continue this effect by cutting shapes. You don't have to cut squiggly or wiggly lines. You can choose what shapes to cut for your background. I just chose to make wavy lines. So you're gonna fill your entire background to the desired effect that you want, and you can kind of see here, this is the finished product that I created. So the whole background is filled with squiggly lines. And I've glued down all of these sections, okay? So then what will happen is once you bring your piece back to us, we are going to place your piece on top of a colored background. So you remember the sample that it's on a blue background. We're going to place it on a colored background that matches the color scheme you chose. And we're going to place the textured paper underneath when it's fired, and the paper will kind of burn off and disintegrate, but leave the imprint of the texture that you created, which then leaves you with those squiggly lines like in the sample here.